You may or may not know much about the work of the RSCM, the Royal School of Church Music. We are an educational charity which has been working since 1927 to nurture, educate and support church musicians, including, of course, church choir trainers. And whilst our main focus is on supporting music in worship, lots of our resources can be used in wider contexts too. The RSCM has a particular interest in education. We work to establish patterns of lifelong learning. Our work and resources serve people at all skill levels, all ages, and from a wide range of backgrounds. We aim to inspire a culture of learning through study and practice. Voice for Life is a whole approach to singing which you can use with your choir. The Voice for Life Guide to Choir Training offers helpful, practical guidance and advice, whether you are new to choir training or a seasoned pro, and regardless of the kind of choir you direct. Singers can engage with the graded series of Voice for Life workbooks, and we offer a comprehensive range of support materials for teaching the contents, all with the aim of helping your singers understand better the music they sing. You can enter the Voice for Life awards too, and we now have new and growing online support materials to help singers prepare for these. Adults are just as welcome to take them as young choristers. If you want to buy any of these resources or any sacred choral music for your choir, do take a look at our web shop. There's a very extensive catalogue of materials available, including our new virtual choir kits and a new anthology of brand new carols for sopranos, altos and men. We're currently working on exciting new plans for many more events to support choir trainers in their skill development. These will be rolled out over the next year as part of a reinvigoration of our training programmes. Sign up for our newsletter on our website to keep up to date with our progress.
Hello, my name's Brian Kay and I'm honoured to be a Vice President of the Royal School of Church Music. And I'd like to invite you to join me on Thursday, January the 28th at 7 o'clock, when I'll be in conversation with Hugh Morris, the Director of the Royal School of Church Music. We're going to be talking about my life in music and also, of course, about the work of the RSCM. Church music has been central to my life for well over 60 years, and I can't imagine life without it. So I'd love you to share my thoughts in what I hope will be an informative and entertaining conversation. Do join me if you can on Thursday, January the 28th at 7 o'clock, and I look forward to your company.
Hello there, and good afternoon. It's lovely to be able to welcome you to the second of our RSCM Lunchtime lectures in 2021. As Brian said, my name's Hugh Morris and I'm Director of the Royal School of Church Music. Today, we're joined by Chloe Allison, who's recently completed her doctoral research in the Cambridge University Music Faculty. That work's been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And she's also an Honorary Vice-Chancellor's Award holder. As well as being an academic musician, Chloe sustains a performing career, a vibrant one. With her lead duo partner, Adam McDonough, she's a 2019-20 Making Music Selected Artist and was a finalist in the London Song Festival British Art Song Competition in 2019. She's performed as a soloist with a number of Cambridge orchestras, most recently singing Wagner's wonderful Wesendonck Lieder with the University Symphony Orchestra as the winner of their concerto competition. So Chloe, it's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we're looking forward to what you have to say to us in this really interesting world that you've been studying. And for those of you who are new to this lecture series and haven't joined us before, just to explain that the format is, there's a lecture that Chloe is about to give, which will be 45 minutes. You can use the YouTube chat, if that's the format you're watching on, to tell us where you're from and to ask any questions. We'll be able to put those to Chloe at the end of the session. If you're watching on Facebook, you can do the comments in the same way and we'll be able to receive and put those to her. We'd love to hear from you. It's a great chance for you to engage with us and live with Chloe. At the end of the lecture, I'll be giving out the code for any non-RSCM members who'd like to take advantage of our discount offer to be able to become an individual member of the RSCM for a year at a 10% discounted rate. That code applies until 5 p.m. next week. And finally, before we get the lecture started, this lecture is free to watch and free to engage with. but we do encourage you to consider making a donation in appreciation. We're a charity and we rely on the generous support of individuals like you to enable us to keep supporting church music and church musicians. Chloe, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this lecture, and to Hugh and to the RSCM for having me. Thank you also to Tim Ruffer for all his help behind the scenes getting the technology to work. As Hugh said, for the last 3 years, I've been completing my doctoral research in the music faculty at Cambridge. My focus has been the vocal music sung first at Notre Dame and then at other churches across Western Europe at the end of the 12th century and into the 13th. This music has come to be known as Parisian polyphony. Polyphony meaning simply when more than one vocal line is being sung at once. I'm really looking forward to introducing you to it today and sharing some of the results of my research. Parisian polyphony is very different from anything that we are used to hearing on a regular basis. Because it's quite complicated and does not exist in editions that are accessible to most performers, it's extremely seldom performed or recorded. My plan had been to record examples to support this lecture with my performance collective Marginalia, one of the aims of which is to bring together current research and top quality performance. Lockdown restrictions made that very difficult, so I've done what I can myself and with a member of my support bubble, Dr. Mark Darling, to whom I am immensely grateful. So to begin with, I want us to imagine what it would have been like to live in Paris in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Life in Paris was exciting, and for lots of people, the standard of living was, by comparison to elsewhere, very good. This was because during the first part of the 12th century, it had become the seat of the French royal family and their aristocratic court, and had therefore become politically stable and economically prosperous. Paris was busy and getting busier all the time. During this period, the city's infrastructure was greatly improved, supporting and no doubt also encouraging rapid population expansion, a rise from about 25,000 in the early 12th century to 80,000 by the mid-13th. As Paris became more important, it attracted scholars and students from all across Western Europe. The city soon became full of leading thinkers who together created a hugely engaging intellectual environment. More and more schools of theology and the seven liberal arts sprang up and expanded, and this collection of individual schools was officially recognized as a university by Pope Innocent III in 1215. For my part, I sometimes wonder if this intellectually stimulating university environment might have been quite like Cambridge in some ways. That is, when it's actually possible for students and academics to be in Cambridge. Back to Paris. New buildings were springing up everywhere. But the building work you would have taken the most notice of began on the Ile de la Cité in the middle of the river in 1163. This was, of course, work on the new Cathedral of Notre Dame. It's an impressive church now, and the world's response to the tragedy of the fire in 2019 certainly shows how loved and important it is as a cultural and spiritual symbol today. This was certainly also the case in the 12th century. Apart from the palace, also on the Ile de la Cité, there were no other buildings in Paris so awe-inspiring, and it would have dominated the skyline in a way that's difficult for us to imagine. It was a monumental project that took nearly 170 years to complete, and it's testament to the cultural and political importance of Paris at that time. So what has all this to do with music? Well, lots of these things altogether contributed to creating an environment where Paris could become not only the leading intellectual centre of Western Europe, but the leading musical one too. Firstly, and quite simply, as students and scholars arrived to study at the university, the available pool of musicians greatly expanded. This meant that there was a great deal of competition for employment as a singer in Paris, and those who did gain employment in Paris's various churches were the very best and most skilled around. Second, there was now a really very impressive cathedral church in which to sing. This in itself must have been inspiring and may well have contributed to the desire to create music that was just as impressive. More tangibly though, the cathedral church simply had lots of money and could therefore employ lots of the very best musicians to sing on a regular basis. Having such rich musical resources was vital in the development of a new kind of music making. Finally, and again less tangibly, it cannot be denied that Paris was full of ambition at this time. Ambition in industry, in construction, in business, intellectual ambition. It was in this environment that by far the most ambitious music ever sung in Western churches up until this point also came to be created. So what did it mean to be a singer in Paris at this time? What actually was your job? The job of singers employed at Notre Dame and other Parisian churches was not to create or sing polyphony at all. It was simply to sing plain chant for the daily services of Mass and the daily celebration of the divine offices, as singers had done for centuries before them. This meant they sang every day, several times a day. They knew all this plain chant by heart and learnt it all orally. They might have used a chant book occasionally, but not to learn a chant or to perform it. It would simply have been to remind them of a chant melody they already held in their heads and to tell them which day to sing it on. This in itself involved a great amount of skill and a very well-trained memory. On Sundays, however, it was not just plain chant that these musicians sang. Christmas, Easter, and the other important feast days in the church calendar deserved something a little more. For probably at least 3 centuries, musicians had been marking important feast days by decorating chant melodies, sprucing them up, if you will, by adding other vocal lines to them. I'm going to refer to this kind of decorating as singing a chant polyphonically. To begin with, this just involves singing chant melodies in parallel fifths and octaves. Later on, the additional voices began to have more freedom, and a greater variety of intervals were formed between the voices. Parisian musicians at the end of the 12th century, however, developed entirely new ways of singing chant polyphonically that were much more complicated. The music that they sang was not only the most ambitious of its kind from this period, but also came to be the most widely disseminated, thanks to scholastic migration to and from Paris across Western Europe. Based on both the existence of extant manuscripts and fragments, and the study of lost sources mentioned in catalogues and inventories, it is known that Parisian polyphonic music made its way to other cities in France, to various cities in Britain, to Spain, to Rome, to Poland, and perhaps even as far as Sweden. So what was new about Parisian polyphony? There were 2 new kinds of polyphony. The first, Organum purum, is similar to what had gone before, but was on a much more lavish scale. It involved the notes of the chant melody being stretched out and sung for many times their usual length, with long and virtuosic melodies being created over the top of them. These melodies were not rhythmic in the sense we think of today. They moved freely, more like chant melodies. Here you can see an example. It's a section from a 2-part elaboration of the chant Judea et Jerusalem constantes estote, which was a responsory chant sung at Vespers for Christmas. The chant melody is being sung by the lower of the 2 voices, and the upper voice is singing newly created melodies. We're going to sing this passage for you now. We'll first sing the chant melody, as it might usually have been sung, so not polyphonically, and then we'll sing an elaboration of that chant melody in Organum purum, the one you can see here. This is the chant melody. Then we'll sing it as Organum purum. I hope we're now going to be able to hear the same short section, but you'll be able to see how this passage is notated in the manuscript I've transcribed this from. As you'll see, the notation of this music is very different from notations we're used to. I'm not going to have time to talk about that much during the lecture, but I will happily talk more about it in the questions if that would be of interest. You'll need to just look at the top of the page to where the word videbitis starts, and then follow through from there. This is the chant melody. Then we'll sing it as Organum purum. Thank you very much to Tim for sorting that out for us. The other kind of Parisian polyphony came to be known as Discant. This was completely new, as it was the first polyphony that was rhythmic in a way we might recognise today. Before this point, there had certainly been rhythm. The rhythm involved in the singing of chant and earlier polyphony has been greatly debated, but it most probably involved the elongation or stressing of particular syllables of the text or particular melodic shapes. It would not have involved beats that were a fixed distance apart from each other, as we are used to now. Although when we get to Discant, we're still a long way from meter, hierarchies of beats within a time signature. We do start to get measured rhythm, beats that are a fixed distance apart. This system involved a set of repeating rhythmic patterns. These patterns might go simply dum, 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 with each note the same length, or they might go dum, dee, dum, dee, dum, dee, dum, or the opposite, dee, dum, dee, dum, dee, dum, dum. And then there's another that's a combination of those various different patterns that goes dum, dee, dum, dee, dum, dum. Eventually, all of these patterns together became known as the different rhythmic modes. In Discant, the chant melody would be sung in one of these patterns, often the most simple, dum, dum, dum. Other voices could then be added over the top of it, and because the chant melody was sung in measured rhythm, to a fixed and repeating pattern, musicians could control how the additional voices coordinated with it exactly. This meant that they could control which sounds were made by the two voices together and could stick to forming consonant sounds between the two voices, unisons, fifths, and octaves, rather than sounds considered dissonant, which was almost everything else. In Discant, therefore, polyphony was not limited to either much earlier note against note styles, where one note is added in the additional voice for each of the chant notes, and the two voices then just move together, or the style where the notes of the chant were greatly sustained, as in Organum and purum. Both voices could move relatively quickly and with different numbers of notes in each voice. We're going to sing you an example of Discant now. This time it's from an elaboration of the chant In Columbae Vox Domini, which was a responsory chant sung at Vespers for Epiphany. Again, the chant melody is being sung in the lower voice, but here you can see that this time it's moving much faster. The upper voice looks similar to the upper voice of the Organum and purum example, but the notes are arranged into groups to show how this might be sung rhythmically. In my research, I have chosen not to focus on rhythm, which is a thorny topic, particularly where two-voice polyphony is concerned. I have not therefore transcribed this passage rhythmically. I've simply reflected the arrangement of the notes in the manuscripts. When I sing it, the rhythm is based on these patterns, and I'll happily talk more about interpreting this kind of notation in the questions. In this example, again, we will sing the chant melody first in free rhythm. Then we will sing the chant melody elaborated in Discant. The chant is sung to a very simple pattern, dum, 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 and the upper voice is sung in mostly what we call mode 1, dum, dee, dum, dee, dum, dee, dum. The notes move more quickly in the upper voice melody, but the rhythmic pattern in both allows the voices to be aligned exactly and means that only consonant intervals sound between the two. This is the chant melody.
Majestatis intonuit.
Then we'll sing it in Discant.
Majestatis
And now we're going to be able to hear the same thing again, but again, seeing how it's notated in the manuscript. You need to look about halfway down and over to the right-hand side of the page to see where the word majestatis starts. This is the chant melody.
Majestatis intonuit.
Then we'll sing it in Discant.
Majestatis intonuit.
Thank you very much to Tim for that. Until this point, I have talked only about polyphony for two voices. Organum purum is always for two voices, but the new rhythmic system also meant that musicians were for the first time able to coordinate polyphony for 3 and 4 voices at once. 2 4-voice pieces survive, one for Christmas and one for Easter. They're hugely virtuosic and very long, appropriate for expressing the glory of the most important feast days in the church's calendar. Obviously, under the circumstances, I was not able to record an excerpt of one of these pieces, but perhaps because they are the most famous and the grandest in scale, these have been already recorded, and I will play you a short excerpt of one of them now. It's a setting of the chant Viderant Omnes Notum Fecit Dominus, which was sung as the gradual for Mass on Christmas Day. You'll hear that the bottom of the 4 voices holds the notes of the chant for a very long time, and the 3 upper voices are all rhythmicized. There is a strong beat, and the different voices follow similar but not entirely the same rhythmic patterns. They weave in and out of each other, forming consonant intervals between themselves and the chant. I will play you a little of the beginning. You'll hear that they're singing to the very first syllable of the text, the V of Viderant, all the way through this passage. To give you a sense of the scale of this, the first syllable is sung for a whole 40 seconds, and this particular recording of the whole piece lasts nearly 12 minutes. So, having introduced you to what I hope you'll agree is the beautiful and perhaps intriguing sound world of Parisian polyphony, I'm now going to focus more directly on a particular aspect of my research into this wonderful but sadly often all too silent music. My research focuses on the question of exactly how musicians went about creating this kind of new and complex polyphony, specifically organum purum, which, just as a reminder, is the 2-voice style with sustained notes in the lower voice. I first became interested in Parisian polyphony in the 3rd year of my undergraduate degree. I'd always been interested in the historical, cultural, and sociological aspects of music. I was an essay writer, not a composer or analyst, so I took courses on things like Sibelius, Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, Schubert's Winterreise, and North Indian classical music. All of these courses involved historical work of some kind, and I very much enjoyed them all. Parisian polyphony poses a different kind of challenge to the historian, however. In letters, diaries, newspapers, and other contemporary accounts, we can read about how Sibelius went about his composition and how he fought to maintain artistic integrity while becoming a national icon in Finland. We know a great deal about Mozart as an artist and a person. We know lots about the operatic traditions within which he worked and which he gently pulled apart. We know who his singers were, we know how his operas were received, and so on and so on. North Indian classical music is still a living tradition, and its current practitioners, as well as interviews and recordings of earlier musicians and other historical accounts, can help us to unlock its history, particularly how its practice was shaped by great social and cultural changes in India during the first half of the 20th century. Arguably, in lots of these cases, there is so much information, so many ways to explore these histories, that the job of the historian is to know where to start, to choose that which will be the most forthcoming or the most interesting. Where Parisian polyphony is concerned, the historian's job is very different. There are almost no contemporary accounts describing how musicians created this music, who they were, or what they thought. There are only a very limited number of accounts that tell us anything about this music at all, really. It is mentioned in treaties, but this is usually only where authors describe the workings of the rhythmic system, or which intervals were acceptable between the 2 voices and which were not. There are also some surviving records at Notre Dame which mention how many singers were to be employed on particular feast days and how much they were to be paid, and edicts by the Bishop of Paris talking about what kinds of polyphony were to be sung for particular feast days. But where descriptions of Parisian music and musicians are concerned, that is it. I admit that might immediately put most people off. In fact, you'd probably be quite sensible if that did put you off. To me, however, the idea of having to be very much a detective historian was exciting. I love teasing out meaning and inference from the small amount of evidence that survives, piecing together fragments to try and shine a light on a very well-hidden picture, working out what we can say, getting us as close to the answer as possible, and accepting that sometimes we will perhaps just never know. This is what drew me to the question, how did musicians create Organum purum? Because it's a question to which no straightforward answer really exists, because there's no straightforward way to explore it, because to get us closer to the answer, the historian needs to be a detective. Honestly, that question would be impossible to answer if the limited surviving descriptions of musicians and their music making were the only things I was using. Luckily, they were not. There are 3 large manuscripts which contain lots of organa, pieces that elaborate plain chant, and which contain Organum purum. It is mainly these that I've used for my research. The 3 manuscripts together contain approximately 100 organa for 2 voices, and lots of other polyphony besides. They are therefore a hugely rich source of information. As sources go, even these are not without their issues, however. There are 2 problems with using these notated collections of polyphony to explore creation. First, the earliest of these manuscripts was copied in the 1230s, and the other 2 around 1250. That's probably between 50 and 70 years after this kind of polyphony was sung at Notre Dame and elsewhere for the first time. It's very difficult to know what might have happened in these years, how the music in these late manuscripts might have related to that sung much earlier. All 3 of these manuscripts are more like collected editions than practical manuscripts. Only one of them shows any of the kind of wear we'd expect from being used by performers, and none of them would have been used during performance itself. The most expensive and beautifully decorated one was possibly a royal commission. Absolutely no performers would ever have been allowed near that particular manuscript. It's a record of an important musical tradition, a museum really, a record in perpetuity, very distanced from actual musical practice. I hope we might be able to see some images of it now. So this is manuscript F, which was copied in Paris in about 1250 and is now held in a library in Florence. It's the largest of the 3 manuscripts and very much the smartest. It uses the finest grade parchment and is extremely neatly copied all the way through. It also has very plentiful decoration, as we can see here in this image from the beginning of the manuscript. This shows the 3 kinds of music according to the philosopher Boethius. At the top, we have musica mundana, or musica universalis, which governs how the planets align and form celestial consonances with each other. The next row down, we have musica humana, which governs how the different systems in our own bodies work in harmony with each other. And then finally, at the bottom, we have musica instrumentalis, which is the only kind we can actually hear. This kind of extensive decoration in a music book is rare and would have been very expensive to commission. Decoration continues to appear throughout the manuscript. Here you can see the first page of fascicle 3, which contains the 2 voice pieces I've been working on. This first piece is Judea et Jerusalem, and we sang part of that earlier. It's for Vespers at Christmas. The image on the left, appropriate to the festival for which this piece was created, contains some of the genealogy of Christ. As well as the fact that these were late manuscripts, not used by performers, the other problem with these manuscripts as witnesses is that simply because they contain notated, fixed pieces of polyphony, they are in a way antithetical to the creative practice which we are trying to access through them. It is certainly true that there was an accelerated interest in the 13th century in developing ways of notating polyphony. Theoretical treatises began to appear from the second quarter of the 13th century, discussing, among other things, systems for notating the new rhythm so important to Parisian polyphony. Outside of music, this coincided with the steep growth of the book trade more generally to supply the newly formed and expanding university. With increased numbers of scholastic and ecclesiastical institutions, as well as individual royal and aristocratic patrons, there was both the demand for and the money to support developments in technologies of bookmaking. Just a few minutes from the cathedral in the Rue Neuve Notre Dame lay one of the first medieval centers of commercial book production. Despite this, the creation and circulation of polyphony was definitely still mostly oral. 12th and 13th century singers had an excellent capacity for oral creation as well as memorization. Their memories were extremely well trained and written records were seldom used in performance. As I mentioned, they sang the yearly cycles of chant for the Mass and the office from memory, and it's likely that they could have created even the most complex or intricate polyphony orally. They had certainly inherited a tradition where polyphony was created in this way. Musicians had made polyphony either simply as they sang it during performance, perhaps we would term that improvisation, or if not, they crafted it orally before performance. Written records were made after the fact. They were transcriptions of music created orally, rather than records of music created in writing that were then performed. As I've mentioned, surviving records of Parisian polyphony were not the kind intended for regular use by performers. That's not to say that other polyphony was not notated, but it's very unlikely that singers had regular access to it. Cultivating your memory and your skills of oral creation was also certainly not limited to the musical realm. The medieval art of memory and of rhetoric involved training your memory so it could support oral creation. For instance, there were various techniques which allowed the text of the Psalms to be organized and stored neatly and efficiently in the memory so that they could be called upon when you were making a speech or giving a sermon. This might have involved storing information in almost a filing cabinet created in your mind, or assigning different psalm verses to the different rooms of a house you've created in your mind. You could then retrieve them by walking through the different rooms in your imagination. These kinds of skills were taught at the university, at which many of the Notre Dame singers probably also studied. What we have then are 3 collections of notated, fixed pieces of polyphony, copied several decades after this music was first sung. And we need to use them to find out about a musical tradition that was mainly oral, and which likely involved regular creation and recreation by lots of different singers, both before and during performance, and in which the same chant was perhaps never elaborated in quite the same way twice. This dissonance between the only surviving witnesses to this musical tradition and that musical tradition itself is one of the challenges that this music poses to the historian. So when I began my research, once I had spent a number of months transcribing lots of organa in a notation that meant I could work with them more easily, I was a bit at a loss what to do next. I was not exactly sure how to use these pieces to find out about creation. Being a singer myself, I thought the best way to start would probably be to sing lots of them, to try and start putting myself in the shoes of Parisian singers 800 years ago. As I was doing this, I soon found myself thinking, haven't I sung a melody like this before somewhere? Haven't I seen a pattern like this before? Haven't I used this sequence? And so on. It turned out I was right. And before long, I realized quite how similar lots of organ and purum melodies were. To begin with, most organ and purum melodies were like chant melodies. They move mostly by step and within a narrow range, carefully balancing movement up and down. This we might expect, given that these singers sang chant much more often than they did polyphony. This is not where the similarity ended, however. To start with, it seemed that singers had shared particular ways of beginning and ending phrases. This did not just mean using the same kind of consonants at the start and ends of passages and sections. This also affected melodic detail. Phrases that started with the same pair of notes in both voices often proceeded in similar ways, and there were also a set of standard patterns which were used to end phrases. Here we can see 2 examples where the melody begins by rising from a step below up onto the opening consonants with the chant. You heard that at the start of the example I sang earlier on. This pattern appears regularly at the start of sections across the repertory. In these next examples, we can see 2 sections that begin with an F in the chant voice. The melodies above them move very similarly. They oscillate between 2 pivot points, a fifth above the chant note, a C, and an octave above the chant note, an F. They move between these 2 points relatively quickly, exploring that 4th range thoroughly before the range is then expanded downwards. Melodies like this appear regularly when the first chant note of a section is an F. In the next set of examples, we can see melodies that begin with a third between the 2 voices, an A in the chant and a C above it. In all these instances, the upper voice then ascends by step to a 5th, creating an A and an E, and then often establishes that consonance with an oscillating pattern before moving off somewhere else. Melodies that begin in this way are also common across the repertory. As well as sharing ways of beginning melodies, musicians also shared ways of ending them. Often ending patterns involved repeated notes. You can see the most common one here. It involves simply a rising and then falling pair of repeated notes. Here, you can see another ending pattern, also involving repeated notes. This was also used a great deal. It involved oscillating either side, up and down, either side of the final pitch. Sometimes ending melodies involved rising fourths, as you can see in these examples. They would only appear if the melody beforehand had moved downwards by step, so that the overall melodic movement was balanced, but there are as many endings that end with fourths as there are with repeated notes. Finally, musicians often use versions of this oscillating pattern at cadences. It involves a downwards oscillation and then a stepwise descent, and then this would often also be followed by a rising stepwise ascent into the cadence, onto the final consonants with the final chant note. As well as techniques and patterns for starting and ending melodies, musicians also had particular ways of using large intervals. For instance, if you jumped a long way in one direction, you usually immediately balance that movement with stepwise movement in the opposite direction. You can see that here. I've marked 2 descending sixths in red. These are then followed immediately by stepwise movement that is rising to balance out those large descending intervals. Musicians also shared ways of using repeated notes. They were often used at the tops and bottoms of phrases, marking the boundary tones, as well as to decorate descending scales. You can see that here. I've marked pairs of repeated notes in red. They appear at the top and the bottom of ascents and descents throughout. Finally, musicians seemed also to have standard ways of using repetition, development, sequencing, and mirroring to generate melody. Often, they would progressively expand the range of a pattern. In this first example, that involved repeating the first part of the pattern and then extending the scale downwards by 1 step. In the second example, the pattern is repeated 3 times, and within it each time, the intervals are gradually expanded downwards, stretching the melodic range and developing the pattern. In the next example, again, a pattern is repeated and gradually developed. Each of the 3 ordinates, which are the things that look like bars, begin with the same descending pairs of repeated notes. Then the melodies are developed and the range of the pattern gradually expanded downwards, first to A and then to G. In the second example, again, each order begins in the same way, with a descent from E. The first one is a simple scale. In the second one of the intervals is expanded to a third. And in the last one, the descent is preceded by an oscillation and the overall pattern is greatly expanded. As well as using development in these systematic ways to spin their melodies out, musicians also often used mirroring and inversion. Here, both ordinates begin with the same rise from B to D, but the first then ends descending and the second with a balancing ascent. Sequences were also a very useful tool. They were used particularly over the penultimate chant notes of sections. These were often long and virtuosic, as you can see here. These sequences are over just 1 tenor note, but sometimes each individual iteration of the sequence appeared over separate tenor notes, as you can see here. Altogether then, what I found, first by singing lots of organ and purum melodies, and then by analysing and comparing them, was that there were melodic ideas, creative techniques, and polyphonic strategies that appeared again and again across different organa. It seemed, therefore, that singers shared a number of ways of singing that supported lots of different aspects of their creation. We might call these ways of singing altogether a creative idiom. If you were creating organ and purum, nearly all of the decisions you had to make might have been supported by this idiom in some way. For instance, you were likely to pick a particular opening consonant depending on the note of the chant. You were then probably likely to have some idea how opening melodies that started on that consonant usually went. You could then use various different kinds of repetition and development as you spun out your melody and moved through the chant. And perhaps you would finish the section with a sequence over the penultimate tenor note before using one of several typical ending patterns you knew. The answer then to the question of how did singers create organ and purum is that they had a creative idiom that they shared and which gave them various ideas and tools for creating melodies. If we zoom outwards and consider what we know of these singers, this picture of their creation makes a good deal of sense. They sang together every day. They were trained in the same way. They already shared a melodic language in the chant they sang every day. If they were singing polyphony, one day they might be singing the chant. The next, they might be creating an upper voice to sing above it, and vice versa. In this environment, they would have learned from each other and shared ways of creating melodies. The best methods would have been used regularly and would therefore have become the favorite methods. In this way, an idiom would have developed, one which supported lots of different aspects of the creation of organ and purum. The creation of this kind of polyphony was therefore very much community music making. There is also the possibility that development of this kind of creative idiom, made up of various repeating strategies and patterns, was related to the creation of this polyphony being oral. In this, we need to look at ideas developed not in the musical realm, but in the study of classical epic poetry, particularly Homer. The oral literary theorist Milman Parry was the first to argue that Homer's epics were created and transmitted orally, not by just a single man, but by many generations of oral traditional poets. He argued that the many repeating formulas found in these poems were a result of pressure on poets to create verse according to strict metrical patterns in performance. He identified particular noun epithet formulae, such as grey-eyed Athena or swift-of-foot Achilles, as repeatable, memorable chunks designed to fit easily in dactylic hexameter, pointing out that the reason Athena remains grey-eyed, regardless of whether this is appropriate to the narrative, is the result of the oral medium, not some aesthetic choice. The formulas and systems described by Parry help the poet to maintain continuity in performance. That is to say, they help them to cope with the pressure of composing in performance lines of poetry that made syntactical and narrative sense, and that also conformed to repeating metrical patterns. A singer creating organ and purum would not have been under quite the same kind of pressure. There is no need to create melodies that fit into a repeating meter as in poetry, but they do still have to keep going. Possibly just as poets turn to repeatable chunks of poetry, singers might have turned to repeating melodies, standard ways of creating phrases, or typical ways of using repetition in order to keep going when creating polyphony orally. This question of whether this shared creative idiom can be seen as the result of that creation being oral is an interesting one, and one which I hope to explore further in my research. As I mentioned earlier, writing was certainly on the rise during this period, and there is certainly an extent to which oral and literate processes of creation and of circulation coexisted. The problem for us is that, to begin with, written creation might have been very similar to oral creation. It might really have been a written record, a transcription of something that a musician created orally in their head first. I present these ideas on the relationship between this shared idiom and orality, with some tentativeness at this stage, therefore, but I would happily talk about it more in the questions if that's of interest. Leaving this question of orality aside for a moment then, what can be said about the identification of this shared idiom is that it gives us a way around the problem I outlined earlier, around the dissonance between my late sources containing notated fixed organa and the fluid oral practice they represent. It shows that these organa need not be viewed as individual pieces, not as separate fixed musical creations, but altogether as a record of a way of singing, a record of a creative practice. In a way, it doesn't matter in which organum a particular melody was recorded. There are simply lots of melodies, and all of them give an insight into how singers went about their creation. Similarly, it doesn't really matter which versions of organa have survived, since the individual organa are not in fact important in themselves in these particular forms. Although, of course, exploring their particular forms is an interesting and important thing as well, particularly comparing different versions of the same piece in the different manuscripts, which is something I could talk about in the questions again. If we look not at how individual organa were created, therefore, but at the creative practices to which they bear witness, it's possible to develop a more general understanding of creation. And this allows us to use the fixed notated pieces to learn about a vibrant and fluid musical tradition, of which they were just one crystallization, a shadow, an echo, if you will. In this way, we catch a glimpse of all the polyphony that was sung and never notated, or that which was notated but did not survive, even if we can never access that polyphony directly. It also gives us an insight into the minds of singers who are extremely creative and skilled, but whose names were never recorded. It gives us a glimpse of the products of their creative endeavor, even though most of them are lost to us. Even if we cannot hear exactly what they created, we can hear how they created it, and our imaginations will need to fill in the rest. That's one of the things I find so exciting about working with this music. In a particular melody, I can hear decisions made by a nameless singer over 800 years ago. In looking at a manuscript, I can follow the thought process of a scribe as he copied and dealt with the various challenges that entailed. Those writing histories of the marriage of Figaro get an insight into the thought processes of one of the world's most gifted musicians. That is, of course, thrilling in its own way, but for me, the ability to hear echoes of musicians from 1200 is exciting in an entirely different way. The music that these musicians created did become extremely famous. As I mentioned, it traveled far across Europe and was collected into extremely expensive books, possibly commissioned by very important people. But Parisian polyphony started out just as a set of ways of elaborating chant polyphonically. It started out life as a group of highly talented singers working together to develop exciting ways to sing. It sounds like quite an attractive lifestyle to me, spending part of the day being surrounded by some of the period's greatest thinkers, and part of it creating and singing truly thrilling new kinds of music. I'm sure it wouldn't all have been rosy, but I hope today I've shown you a little of what music making in Paris at the end of the 12th century would have been like. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today. I've greatly enjoyed being able to share some of my research with you, and thank you very much to the RSCM for having me. Oh, Hugh, we can't hear you. You're still muted.
Perhaps you can now. So, thank you so much for your sharing of what is your interest and your passion in your research. Fascinating insight into it. So, as Chloe suggested, there are lots of topics that we might pick up in conversation and questions. If you haven't put a question in, now's a great opportunity to do so, and we'll try and pull some of those out. Before we get to the questions, though, here's a word from Sal McDougall, who is one of my deputy director colleagues at the RSCM. Sal.
Thank you, Hugh, and thank you, Chloe, for such a great lecture, and thank you to you for joining us today. This may be your first encounter with the RSCM, and if so, if you're new to the RSCM, let me just tell you a little bit about us. The RSCM is an educational charity. We exist to nurture and support church musicians, and we work across all parts of the church to support church musicians wherever they are and whatever their tradition. Education is absolutely at the heart of what the RSCM is. And it's been great through this lecture series to welcome new friends who've come alongside us as we've extended our reach through this initiative. But of course, there's always more that we could do. So if you're enjoying today's lecture, can I ask if you're able that you consider making a donation to support our work and to help us to be able to do even more to support the music of our churches, perhaps needed now more than ever. As I've said, we are a charity. We receive no funding from the church or indeed from the state or from any other major external funding body. The text at the bottom of the screen tells you how you can make a donation, and if you'd like to take advantage of our membership code offer, then please go instead to our website where you'll find more information about that, along with information about other ways in which you can support our work financially. You may, for example, think about becoming a friend of the RSCM. In conclusion then, friends, wherever you are, however you found your way here today, however you relate to the RSCM and however you support us. Thank you for being with us as a fellow traveller with the RSCM. Thank you. Back to Hugh and to Chloe.
Thank you very much, Sal. It's really good of you to join us. Just in terms of the, Sal talked about becoming a member and things. If you go to our website, we've put a shortcut. If you click on the donate thing, it opens to give you access to exploring all of those things about becoming a member or a friend or so forth. It's all just via the donate gold button at the top. Now, finally, before we move on to those questions, next week's lecture will be given by one of my direct predecessors in this role, former RSCM Director, Professor Dr. John Harper, and he'll be talking about the Chapels Royal of Charles I and Henrietta Maria. And Chloe alluded to it a number of times. So Tim Ruffer, who, as you know, you may know, has presented a number of these in this role, these lectures. He will be back in the hot seat, as it were, next week in the front. He's in the background today, and we're very, very grateful to him continuing to sort things so it all runs so smoothly. So now let's move to those questions. And actually quite a number of these have come in. Lots of appreciation of comments about people being exposed to a world that they weren't familiar with at all. Maybe we should go back to the top of the list there and actually, if you could display that. There was a question in from Sam about earlier music there, I think, Tim, if you were able to go back up to the chat feed. Do you think there could have been undiscovered music from earlier than this period that maybe was there and was just never written down?
That's a great question. And there certainly is some music from earlier than this period written down. The very first inkling that we get of musicians singing chant polyphonically comes from way back in actually the 9th century. And the first places we see that are in treaties. And they are essentially talking about how you would go about singing a chant in parallel fifths and octaves. And that's where we start. And then they start to say, well, you could sing it in parallel fourths. And also if you have some sustained notes in your additional voice, then you'll create some different intervals. And as we go through, then we end up with this really wonderful book called the Winchester Troper, which is 11th century. And that contains lots and lots of polyphony like that. Then if we keep going a little further, we get to Aquitanian polyphony, which is more similar to the kinds of things that I've talked about, similar to Organum purum, where we get sustained notes in the chant. When you get to Paris, it starts happening on an entirely new scale. But there are certainly ways of singing polyphony that the polyphony was certainly happening before this point. We, as with Paris, probably only a tiny fraction of what was sung survives. Because it was all oral, exactly as you say, we get surviving the manuscripts where people decided, actually, let's make a record of this. It's not that they were writing down music that they were then using. So even if it was written down, if it wasn't collected into a book, it probably wasn't. It would be unlikely to survive. And if it wasn't written down at all, then of course we just have to imagine what it would have sounded like based on those ways of singing that we can understand from theoretical treatises mainly, but then also the odd record of practical music making as well.
Absolutely, and it's a very complicated relationship, isn't it? You're talking about between composer and performer, and that oral tradition is so very strong, isn't it? In what they've, as a way of thinking that's feels very sort of unfamiliar to us now, I suppose, who are so used to so much being a written medium.
Absolutely. And I think the idea of picking up on the idea of composer and performer in this music is really important, because I think actually we have to take that division and pretty much throw it out of the window, because what we've got is performers who are also composers and composers who are almost certainly also singers. And we've got composing going on in the act of performing. And we've also got composing going on before performance, but orally. And so it's a kind of a distinction that just, if you try and make it work with this music, you kind of just end up hitting your head against the wall and thinking, why don't we just have composer performers, or just get rid of both and just call everyone musicians? Because scribes are important as well, because as they're copying stuff, they might find that the melody they were meant to be copying doesn't quite fit on the line. So they change it and they create things as well. So in my work, I tend to use the word musician, and that can mean anything from singer to composer to scribe. essentially.
Which puts a completely different sort of take on the way people's whole approach is, and a really obviously interesting existence for those people. Now let's take another one of the questions. There's plenty of questions come in today. Thank you for all those people who've submitted them. You talked about musicians and the importance of them. John Woodhouse gave us a question asking about, does this really mean that the music becomes more, would it be fair to say music becomes more important than the text in this? How would people know what was being sung if the syllables go on for such a long time, as of course some of the extracts you played illustrated?
That's a great question. I think, and in a way, the answer is yes. What we do have to remember is that everyone listening to this music, and certainly the people singing it, would have known the chant melodies and would have known the text that would have gone with those chant melodies. And so they would have known what chant was being sung, why it was being sung on that particular feast day, and why that text was appropriate to that particular feast. So absolutely, when we stretch out these notes for minutes, sometimes we don't hear the text, absolutely. But what we get instead, especially if you imagine that kind of music being sung in this huge ringing acoustic in this glorious new cathedral, we get a way of celebrating the glory and the glory of the message of that text in a way that you can't do when you've just got it being sung as part of a chant melody. So yes, when you're listening to it, you lose the immediacy of the text, but in the background, you know that chant and you know that text. And what you get instead is this way of bringing to life the glory. I can't think of a better word. The glory of that text in a way that you just can't if it's just sung as chant.
I suppose it's the case that because the default setting from which it all came is the plain chant element of it, isn't it? And this is what we're looking at is the very rich elaboration of that, and so this is the special, not the commonplace in that sense. And therefore it's in some way a sort of a glorification of something that's going on, and as a sort of more normal thing, which on an everyday basis you might have encountered in a simpler way, perhaps. Yeah,
exactly. And these huge pieces are sung for Christmas, Easter, Epiphany, Candlemas, all of the important feasts that we would do special services for now. Most days you don't sing polyphony. Most days you just sing chant, and then it's the really special occasions where you get to sing these big pieces.
Now, talking of getting to sing things, there's a question coming from Ten Analu, which is, what do we know about how these singers performed this polyphony, and how did you go about decide how you went to perform it yourself? Because obviously bringing it off the page is quite a challenge, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. So the answer to that is, great question, by the way, is really, we don't know that much, which probably isn't a surprise to people who've just listened to this lecture. We don't get people writing down, this is how we sang this is how we created that. We get treaties, but they mostly talk about how to notate things rhythmically or how to use particular intervals in particular ways. So really, how I decide to go about singing it stems really from trying as hard as I can to put myself in 12th century singers' shoes. And that becomes particularly important when we're talking about organ and purum. Because for Discant, we have rhythm, and there's some ambiguity in how the notation works. And so sometimes there are more than one way of singing it. But the real question is, what do we do with these melodies that don't have rhythm in the conventional sense? And some people have said, oh, they must be modal somehow, there must be some rhythm. Some people have said there's no rhythm at all, and there's been a huge argument and no consensus about it. So what I do is start with creative decisions. And I ask, okay, what is this musician doing with this melody? Is there a pattern that they're developing? Are they looking to explore how quickly they can move through the range? Are they looking to repeat a pattern over and over? And if I understand what they're doing creatively, that can then inform how I would shape my realization of that melody, how I would shape that performance to bring out to the listener, as presumably those singers might have done, their creative thought, their creative process. So it's definitely not an exact science, and I'm working it out all the time. And I think it's something I really want to continue to explore in my research, is what exactly we can know, what exactly we can work out, how close we could get to a sense of what we know about this performance. But I think being a singer myself and singing lots of this music and working it out and listening to the sonorities and following thought processes and thinking about the creative things that they were doing, that's where I start and go from there.
And of course, you mentioned it sort of in the beginning of the lecture that actually these were high-skilled musicians, and they must have been good because there was a lot of competition to doing the jobs because a lot of people were coming. So you are looking at people at a high level of achievement, aren't you?
Absolutely. They were extremely well trained, also vocally extremely good. This music is so hard to sing. The ranges that they go through make it really, really virtuosic and hard. It's not the kind of thing where you just think, oh yeah, it's fine, it's medieval, it's great. It's really hard. And definitely the sense that you get of these musicians when you sing this music is they are really intelligent, really ambitious. They really like experimenting with things. You see, because we've got such big collections, and we get you get the sense that there are different groups of musicians doing different things in different ways in different places and experimenting with some ways of doing things. And one group of musicians decides, oh, we really like doing it this way, so they make lots of that. And in another place, you might say, you see a musician go, what happens if I experiment with this one particular thing, keeping the voices really close together and swapping them over as much as possible, that kind of thing. You get this sense of playing with melody and experimenting with melody that I just find really exciting.
Well, which leads on to and we just alert to the time, we must stop in a moment, I'm afraid. But there's another question from Sam, which talks about the collaborative process in this. And of course, two of the names in this are that are associated with this period, Leonan and Parisian. Question from Sam, were they just scribes, or were they singers that collaborated in this music, or were they part of a collective in the way that you were sort of describing about your own sort of group that realises this music now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was wondering when those guys were going to come up. So for lots of the 20th century, everyone viewed this music as absolutely composed by Leoninus and Paratinus. And they viewed it as the first kind of music composed in the modern sense, where you would have separate composers working in writing who would create something and then give it to performers and they perform it. And we have these names from a theorist called Anonymous 4, who talked about the two composers and said Leoninus came first and was really good at Organum purum, and Paratinus came next and he was good at Discant, and then he sort of updated the repertory and they created this big book of organy. And so for lots of the 20th century, scholars went about trying to work out who these people were, trying to find them in records at Notre Dame, trying to work out how the surviving repertory it reflects the work of one and then the updating by the other. And the problem is that Anonymous 4 was writing in at least the second half of the 13th century, possibly towards the end of the 13th century, probably in England. We don't know when he might have gone to Paris, if he might have gone to Paris. His treatise might have been a version of some lecture notes that he might have written in Paris, possibly, we don't know. It's just a little short aside he gives. It's a big treatise about modal rhythm, and then he just talks about these composers, and he introduces it himself as hearsay. And it's just about giving a little bit of historical context, really. So as we've gone through the 20th century and as we've started to think about creation a little more, we've started to view this music as more continuous with what had gone on before. More continuous with what we might call improvisatory performance practices that had happened before, and to give lots more musicians credit for what was going on here. So the answer really is, we don't know exactly who they were. They might have simply just been important musicians. There's some research that has attached Leoninus specifically to Notre Dame towards the end of the 12th century, and then Paratinus slightly after that. It's sort of in a kind of cantor presenter type role. Equally, they might have been scribes. They might have just been part of this big group. So we've moved from viewing this as a new kind of creation driven by these two composers, to thinking of it as community music making and collaborative and oral and fluid in a way that's saying, here we go, this is composition now, this is the beginning of the Western canon, these are the shoulders upon which everything is built. We've moved away from that. Yeah. Great question. And yes, we don't really know is the answer, as with quite a lot of this, I'm afraid.
Now, sadly, there are more questions, but we're just out of time. So I'm just going to just finish by one of my own, if I may, which is just to say, just briefly, given that you said that you don't know the answers to this and so many things we don't know, if you went back in time and met them, what would be the number one question you'd want to ask them?
Oh, can I come and sing with you? Probably. I'd say, I mean, I know, yeah, that's what I'd say, can I come and spend a week and sing with you? And I think that would answer all of the questions that I would have, I think.
Excellent. And that's a good point, perhaps, to leave the questions. Thank you so much, Chloe.
Great.
And so thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, audience, for being with us. As I mentioned earlier, next week, it focuses back on the Chapel Royal of Charles I and Henrietta Maria. As we also mentioned earlier, if you're able to make a donation or wish to become a member, the details will stay on the screen for a few minutes. And we look forward to seeing you next time. So thank you from all of us, and goodbye.